And we are live. I'm not sure if people have joined yet, but they will probably very soon. And because this is going on YouTube too, I am here with Charles Farina from AdSwerve, and we are about to embark ourselves in a journey. Because last year, in July, we filmed a video about all the new features of GA4. And now, what we'll do, we're in the archives of Google Analytics 4, and we're going to talk about all the new things and exciting things that they have launched or dropped from August last year until today. And then we will take some of your questions as well. And make sure, like, if you are here and you're watching this, to comment, because I will be able to see your comments. Maybe I'm just going to disable it for now. But if you have any questions, comment, and then I will try to go back to the post from yesterday. So now I'm going to shut up. Charles, welcome.
So excited to be here. I just saw on LinkedIn, we're live now. So
Yay!
who knows what's going to happen?
Who knows? Yeah, I don't even know if anyone is watching this right now. So I have to admit that I came up with this idea 2 minutes ago. And I actually paid for this restream stuff. But it's worth it because I think we both really appreciate the response that we got on the post yesterday. It was done on a whim. On Twitter, it didn't go that well, but on LinkedIn, I saw so many questions, and I said, like if most of this audience is on LinkedIn, let's just do this there. So, Charles, I think we can start. Let's go back in time to some cool stuff from August. So, on August 16, 2022, Google added improvements to the data driven attribution that improves model accuracy for conversion types and low conversion volume and short data history. And as a result, they say they will assign fractional credit for more conversion types than before. So, what happened with attribution?
So
This,
I think I was looking back. We first did our webinar almost 12 months ago. So I think we did
yeah,
it in June of last year.
yeah,
So there's been a lot of updates since then. I
yeah,
actually I actually remember on that webinar, I'm pretty sure one of the features I highlighted that I was super excited about was that Google for the first time actually had functionality where you had flexible attribution inside the platform. So users had long been asking for if they could change the attribution model because in universal analytics, all the reports were kind of that last non-direct attribution model.
yep,
And it was kind of exciting because in GA4, there's actually a setting. It still exists at least for a few more weeks until it goes away. But there was a setting where you could change the attribution model for the conversion reports to linear or first touch or
yep,
last touch, showing kind of this new flexibility of GA4. What also has happened in the last year was Google's been making a variety of updates to the Google Ads integrations where you export conversions from GA4 into Google Ads. Historically, those integrations were still kind of very heavily based off last click. In addition, if anyone's ever used Google Ads and Google Analytics, you'll notice at some points there's actually a lot of similarities between both platforms on the
yeah,
reporting side. So as an example, like the attribution models that were available in GA were also available in Google Ads. But historically, the way you'd configure all the settings around them were independently managed.
yep,
So the short is that in addition to Google making some small changes to like DDA, they've also made some more drastic changes. So as an example, they've started to actually unify the settings between ads and analytics. So when you export a conversion from GA to Google Ads, there's no more kind of separate settings, which might result in different counts or
yep,
different representations of it. And that I think was actually a really good change because it makes it probably less confusing as people work across ads and analytics. But the bigger change, if we skip forward to like 2 weeks ago, I think everyone was a little caught by surprise where Google announced they were deprecating all the attribution models except DDA,
Yeah.
driven, and the historic kind of last touch we do.
Yeah.
And I don't know where to start with that one. I have thoughts, but that one was definitely a surprise. So attribution has changed, and it started with, as I think you were saying, some small updates to DDA.
Yeah.
And then it feels like we went 100 miles an hour, where then all of a sudden we deprecated all the other attribution models.
Yeah, like what happened from August? And actually, I wanted to ask you something on this part. Somebody said, I don't remember who on LinkedIn made the post saying that because of all these changes with attribution, it's making it very hard for marketers to use GA4 anymore. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think I can share maybe two different perspectives. I can guess what I think Google's perspective is and what they're trying to do,
Yeah.
and then I can share my own personal thoughts and also what I'm hearing from like some of my customers, especially on the enterprise, like GA360 version.
Yeah.
I think on the Google side, I think there was some intrinsic like good thoughts or motivation behind it, because a lot of marketers probably realize, and some probably don't, that attribution is actually incredibly difficult and challenging and fragmented, and it's only getting more difficult because of the browser, the legislation, and all the changes that are going on in our industry.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think a lot of marketers probably don't realize how different the reports are today than in the past. And an example of that is, by default, all the conversion reports in GA4, especially if you're using DDA or the kind of native conversion attribution reports, they're modeled by default. So Google's already modeling
it.
to help with like Safari's ITP and other signal loss that's happening. And in fact, this might surprise you, but you can't actually see the unmodeled data. The unmodeled data doesn't exist in the UI. You can only see that by going back to BigQuery, creating your own reports. It's modeled by default, and you simply can't change it. So because of that, I think removing the old attribution models, Google claims, and I believe it, that no one was really using them. Also, it probably made things a little bit more confusing. So they're trying to basically use DDA as the default, because with all their case studies of data-driven attribution, they say they have the math to show that it outperforms or provides better representation than kind of the historic last touch or linear or some of the other models. So that's why I think Google's doing it. And it kind of makes sense, because they're trying to make it easy to use and not have all these things to confuse. But now let's take the other side. The analyst in me hates this change, because I feel like attribution still has value, especially when you put attribution in a bucket that's more broad than marketing channels. So historically, attribution in Google has always been solely focused on like marketing channels and campaigns. But for us as analysts and marketers, we do attribution for all sorts of things, like trying to figure out what page led to an interaction, or what sort of products are leading to outcomes or being bought together, or what images, like all sorts of content and creative and interactions are leading to outcomes. So originally I had hoped with GA4 that the attribution would actually become more flexible, so that we could do it for other use cases, which historically, like people who used Adobe would always brag that Adobe had all these capabilities that Google didn't. And I was really excited, because it felt like that's where we were going. But now with all that being taken away, like we still don't have like really good, robust content participation or content attribution. The e-commerce attribution is also incredibly confusing if you try and do it at like a product or a promotion or some sort of other level. And then on top of it, I still think some of the default attribution reports were helpful, like the linear as an example, for just providing like distributed credit. And I worry about only having DDA, because it's basically a black box. And there's black boxes within that black box, because not only is the DDA model kind of closed, you can't, Google hasn't like given the recipe to rebuild it yourself in BigQuery. but also there's conversion modeling and other things that are feeding it. So it's kind of interesting to just have that really as the only default and not have like the linear and other models to like balance it with. So that's why I feel it's actually a big loss. And my hope is that Google might be working on some additional functionality. But right now, like I have to go to BigQuery to solve everything, and that's kind of frustrating as a everyday user.
And that's kind of became like the de facto to everything. I mean, yes, now, I mean, people that, I was saying that I think for a small, medium company, it's not the tool that they should be using because everything pushes you to BigQuery. And it's fine if you can afford that. But a lot of comments that I got yesterday on the post were like, is this tool right for us? We are a small business. We only want to see the basic stuff. Can we survive without having to pay for BigQuery or having to use BigQuery? And sadly, it's kind of hard to determine that. So I think I'm gonna look for one of those questions from our post yesterday, which is exactly on this topic. Let's see, because there were so many. There's okay, so talking about a company website with more or less than 1 million events per day, do we have to pay for third-party suppliers like Supermetrics or Analytics Canvas to threshold the GA4 Looker limits, which have been changed now, and produce Looker Studio reports, or can we use that, or should we use BigQuery directly?
Yeah. So some of these thoughts, I feel like we have to take a big step back. Like there's just the reality that it's a free product. I think that
Yeah,
most people are referring to, right? And
yeah,
if you think about the value you're getting for something you don't have to pay anything for, you could make, I think, a very strong, compelling argument that it's incredibly generous for what it's doing. Also, like I think this is just Google repeating a little bit of history. They kind of have a reputation for releasing things and then making it better over time.
yeah.
And that's my hope with GA4 is that I'm really hoping in the next year we can talk about like what feature updates we'd like to see in it. But if Google can make the product easier to use and introduce new functionality, like I think it can catch up to my love of universal analytics and having like a similar use case parity inside GA4. So there's lots of things around this question of BigQuery. So on one side, BigQuery is actually incredibly cost effective. The most expensive part of it is normally the resources that you'd
Yeah.
have to put behind it, like someone learning how to use BigQuery. But
Yep.
the storage and the querying is actually incredibly inexpensive. And what I also like from what I'm seeing is that there's new resources in the community to
Mm-hmm.
basically learn SQL or learn how to set up BigQuery environments. And the end result is you could basically copy some SQL and put a Looker Studio report on top.
Yeah.
So you're just kind of doing a little bit of the middle work, but the end result is you still have a report, which is a little easy to navigate. And as far as another thing, the last point I think I wanted to think about is Google also changed the commercial model between the old GA360 and the new GA4 360. So the new GA4 360 is actually incredibly more inexpensive to start out with. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to like share what the exact price points are, but it's a lot more inexpensive and affordable to SMBs than GA360 historically was. So if you are hitting some of the limits and like you need a larger set of BigQuery data, there's now a path forward to upgrading, which previously a lot of people couldn't afford.
Yeah.
And additionally, there's also this component where I'm sure you've run into this, Juliana. You don't necessarily need all the data you're capturing in BigQuery. So there's also functionality to filter and
Yeah.
help kind of reduce what you're collecting. So in short, there's lots of functionality. Google still has to make some improvements, but BigQuery doesn't have to be the end all be all. But I guess for that to be true, we do need Google to make some updates.
But think about it. I think a lot of it, like, of course, there is some good parts and bad parts, but I think also it's a very Pavlovian response to things because you're thinking, oh my God, G360 expensive, BigQuery expensive, Google Cloud expensive. But as you said, like I actually have one of my clients, which is an enterprise client that we use BigQuery for, and it's like a few coffees per month. It's not even like the end. It's probably as much as I pay to be live right now on LinkedIn with Restream. So it's like a very cost, effective. But I think, as you said, the biggest hurdle I think for teams is to wrap their heads around GA4, which is a new tool, and then BigQuery if they don't have anyone in their teams that actually knows SQL. And to hire a SQL person is pretty expensive because it's very sexy to know SQL right now. But we're gonna go back to everyone's questions. I kind of want to focus also because this is gonna air on YouTube as well. I want to be conscious of the people on the channel. Would you like for us to go a bit through the interface and talk about what we love and hate in the last years? In
Yeah.
the last months, not years. See, this is the problem with recording live. I would have edited this out.
Yeah. So we can talk about, we're going to talk about like some updates that happened in the last year. And we can go back to some really old ones.
Yeah.
And then we'll also talk about some new ones. So
yes.
I think it'd be fun to start with a new one. So as an example, I'll actually switch accounts. I'm going to go to my AdServe account because I have more admin rights here, which I think will show better. But one of the common requests was essentially Google had default channel groups.
Mm-hmm.
And almost any marketer who starts to use these quickly wants to customize them to create their own definitions, right? So I think one of the biggest updates that Google made, and I'm excited about this for a few different reasons, is that we can now create our own custom channel groups. So I created my pizza grouping, and in here, it's pretty self-explanatory. You basically come in, you make rules. The first channel or first traffic source that meets the criteria gets bucketed into that. And then the other rules will apply if not. So you can create your own channel groups. And I think what I'm super excited about is if we go back to the UI, is this actually solves one of my biggest pain points in the old version of Google Analytics, because these are super accessible. So here's my group. And then this is the part I liked most. If I go to the attribution reports, and as an example, I wanted to do some attribution modeling while I still can, there's my pizza group. It's also available in the attribution reports. For those of you who don't realize how exciting this really is, it's exciting because in the old version of Google Analytics, there's actually multiple channel groups, and you had to define one channel group for attribution and redefine it for the standard reports. And then you'd even have to, I think, define a third one to work with the defaults. So the way this works is it's fully retroactive. It's one channel group for the entire UI, and it works just as you would expect. So this was, I think, one of the most recent exciting releases inside GA4.
Yeah, and I actually had to do one of this for a client, and I had to do it also in 360, Universal 360s and GA4. And looking at them side by side, I realized like this is so much easier than in Universal Analytics because you have to like think it through. Here, the only thing that you need to be careful with, in my opinion, is that the first you need to create the group, and then you have to add the channels to it because it's not very intuitive, the interface of how you can do it. And maybe Charles can show you like, because when I was going to do it the first time, I was like, oh shit, hold on. So it's not the most intuitive thing. So first you have to create the name, the description, you have to save it, and then you can actually add the channels that you want to it.
Yeah, I find like if we're talking feature requests, I'd love to have more options in here. Like you can't use all the UTM parameters, or there's other just kind of traffic source-esque parameters that aren't available. And then I've seen this asked for a lot. Why can't we make it the default, right? You can't change the default group. So it would be cool if and actually impactful if we could change that to the defaults.
Yeah, and regex would be nice too.
Oh, regex everywhere.
Regex would be nice.
I found myself wanting that. So another, there's also some fun ones. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, Juliana. We also got a variety of new dimensions and metrics. So as an example, If I go, I think, to the acquisition report for session data, we can see that we have, I think, engagement time per session. I think that's a new one. We also have, I believe, in our user acquisition, no, I have to customize this to make it happen. But we have a bounce rate. I think I added that in my landing.
Bounce rate. Everyone wanted the bounce rate.
So if we wanted a bounce rate for anyone that hasn't had a chance to really use GA4, bounce rate is now available. It's not added to any of the reports by default. So you actually have to go to like the library is where you can create your customized reports. And then if you edit a report or create a new report, you can come in and add your metrics, which I think are over here. And I believe if we search for bounce rate, we'll have it in our report. So I know this one was controversial. Why was bounce rate a controversial addition to GA4?
They didn't want to add it initially, but I think they just caved because people were like, bounce rate, bounce rate, bounce rate, bounce rate. And it's, what are your thoughts on it? I actually was excited about engagement, but you go and I'll tell you after what I feel about it.
Okay, so for those of you who are somewhat new to GA4, originally Google tried to get rid of bounce rate, and by not having it, they introduced something called engaged sessions and engagement rate. So essentially there's a setting in GA4 and the default is any session that has 10 seconds of activity, and that activity could be like a scroll or they click on something, or if there's
an event, a conversion event,
2 or more page views, or if there's a conversion, it's marked as an engaged session. And that is, in Google's view, a better way than a single page visit with no interactive event, which was the old definition of bounce rate. So I actually never liked engagement rate because I felt that I could actually customize bounce rate and make it more useful than the engagement rate. Because with bounce rate, you could determine what events should impact the bounce rate or not, where in engagement rate, you don't really have the customization. You can kind of toggle the time, but the time component, I think, confuses a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then you can't really customize the conversions because I'm finding a lot of people set up conversions just because they want counts, but they're not really important. Like, it's not something I would use for landing page analysis or want to impact it. So anyways, I found the old definition of bounce rate actually better or more customizable. And the unfortunate part of this new bounce rate is it's not the old definition. If you read it, it's the percentage of sessions that were not engaged. So when they added bounce rate, they just made it the inverse of engagement rate.
Exactly.
So now I find neither are useful for me, and I actually really prefer the old version more, but I don't know if I'm old school because of that.
I mean, I do like engagement, but I like it from different perspectives. Like, for instance, if you're working on UX changes on a page that are supposed to, that they're scoped to keep people there and, engage more time. It's not perfect, but it's something directional at least until you do like a deeper analysis. So I like it from that point of view. And I had something here about it that I lost it. But I like the parameter of engagement time or millisecond part that you can send with events to see, like what happened. And it's also complicated, obviously, for new users. It also, like, when I had to wrap my head around it a bit, it was hard. But you want to show the difference, in UA.
I mean, this is for me what I loved about UA that I'm hoping we can have a path to do in GA4. So when I was doing like landing page analysis, one of my favorite things was if you had a bounce rate which was implemented somewhat correctly, which a lot of people didn't because it was easy to get wrong or make not work. But if your bounce rate was usable, like you could come in and they had these cool things like if you sorted by bounce rate, you could actually do a weighted sort. So it would try and find pages that had a significant amount of traffic and a high bounce rate. So you weren't looking at 100% bounce rate with a page that only had one visit.
Yeah.
So if I'm just trying to quickly scan and say, okay, what pages on my site should I potentially think about doing A/B tests or trying to redesign or just try to look to approve? You could do this all day long, and you could even take it further. You could add a secondary dimension, and then I could say, oh, well, I just want to look at, any of the CPC. And every time you filter for it, you get the weighted sort for the sub selection that you pick.
Yeah.
And that's where I find when we switch over to GA4, like I just can't really do a lot of that analysis as quickly or seamlessly or really at all, because some of that stuff like weighted sort, we don't quite have yet.
Yeah. The weighted part was awesome. Especially when you were doing, again, like I'm thinking it also from an experimentation perspective, that was something that we use a lot, especially for landing page optimization. But I'm trying to stay positive as much as I can and excited. But I think if they would add more customization to this stuff in the future, and I'm sure they will, and they should, I think it would be easier and better for everyone. But I do also get that it's not the same tool, and we cannot have the same expectations of things happening in the same way. Another thing that we just talked about a week ago, we were going back and forth about, is this new user purchase journey report. And I found that it was a bit of an interesting rollout of this feature, because once it rolled out, a lot of properties were having issues with actually seeing the report, but the library disappeared completely. In the report, the library disappeared once this happened. So like now we have a new standard report in monetization called user purchase journey, which is something that you can do in explorations and better, because you would know exactly which are the steps of your customer journey, and you could actually put those. But here we have a standard report. I don't know if you have it right now. Charles is going to show you where it lives if you don't see it in the interface.
I was trying to find it. It's still rolling out now. Usually,
I think you can go on the merch one because they have it.
I checked. It didn't have it for me. Here, let's go look. So we go to Demoverse. We go into Merch Store.
They should have it.
It's not here.
Yeah, that's too bad because I cannot share from NDA. But it's right here. Yeah, we can talk about it.
It is. So basically I like it, but it's also potentially incredibly confusing at the same time.
Yes.
So essentially, there's a feature now where you can add funnels to standard reports.
Yep.
So previously, there's basically in GA4 two separate reporting modules. There's standard reports, and then there's these explore reports. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about this on our webinar back in June. But basically, the summary is the standard reports in GA4 are incredibly limited from an analysis perspective. You can't really do things like apply audiences or advanced search or filter or plot things on graphs like you're used to in the old version of Google Analytics. So they're just kind of quick snapshots of data. And then separately, there's these explore reports, which is basically creating custom reports and analysis from scratch, which are which are incredibly powerful, but might require a lot of work to get started and to get your analysis. And historically, to date, these lived completely separate. You can't take a standard report and use it in Explore, use Explore in the standard reports. There's a way to copy a report and try and create a template, but you can't kind of mix these, is what I'm getting at. So the big change is that Google wanted to add funnels to the standard reports because there's no funnels in these reports. So the e-commerce funnel was basically a basic one. And to do that, Google's now made the decision that they're going to take the funnel tool that's only available in explorations, and now they're using it in the standard reports. So there's one of these funnels that now lives there, and you can also publish your own funnels from the standard report, from Explore into the standard
report.
Yeah.
I think this was just rolled out.
So I know I have some thoughts on this, but what did you like about this rollout?
I mean, I do like the fact that for some clients it's easier because not everyone knows how to use the explorations and it's a learning curve. And it takes, like, you can do basic ones, very simple, but if you're not used to the interface, it's gonna take a bit of time to nail it. And it's very explorations are very powerful when you are using segments and audiences and you can do more analysis, but in the for the novice user, it's hard. But I did like seeing it there. But instantly, I got disappointed because it's not customizable and you cannot edit it directly there, which would make so much sense. You see it and you want to edit it. Like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Because what it happens, and I'm sure you know this, and I'm sure a lot of people know listening, there are companies that don't have the recommended the e-commerce flow that Google has in their documentation. There's clients that have view item, add to cart, shipping, and purchase. Like, it's very different for different clients based on their, how their website is set up. But Google just associates the events that they see, and it doesn't make sense. So if I would be a user, just a user and not an analyst, I would be like, but how do I edit this? I want to put my own steps. So I think it's much more worth it to do it in explorations versus getting happy like how I was for 5 minutes to see it to seeing it there.
Yeah.
That's
So
my thoughts.
I wish I could show a quick demo, but the first thing is this is going to be incredibly confusing from just like a functionality standpoint, because previously, basically, you would describe the standard reports, they're never sampled. There's no like sampling
Yeah.
standard reports. Also, no one has to worry about data retention. So here's a fun
Oh.
one. There's a data retention setting that
Yep.
a lot of people don't realize. It's actually 2 months by default. So if you just created a new GA4 property, you'll want to go check this setting. It's 2 months by default. And what that means is that in Explore, where we're doing all this super powerful stuff like funnels and pathings, it only has the most recent 2 months of
2
data.
months. Yeah,
You can't
correct.
access anything in the past. So that's confusing, right? Why does this section of reports have 2 months, but this section of reports has all of our data, even past 14 months, which is the longest you can set it before. So now that we're using Explore in the standard reports, we're mixing sampling with other reports that aren't sampled.
Oh man.
And now there's this data retention where I'm sure we're going to get lots of people who are like, why can't I access 3 months of my funnel data? And that's because there's this data retention that works differently than standard reports. And then also the functionality, right? So if we go into the funnel inside the, not pathing, the funnel inside explorations, there's all this rich functionality that
Yeah.
Juliana was mentioning. We can build segments. We can drag things on to break things down by country. You can't do any of this in those standard reports. So I wish, like, if Google's going to mix these reports, just bring over all of the analysis functionality. So the analysis is actually quicker and not like completely severed in one side versus the other. Like, they should be more interchangeable or link better. Like, I'm not entirely sure what the perfect solve is, but I
Yeah.
don't feel like just having a limited screenshot of one report in the other is like the best user experience.
And also, like, the thresholding that happens, it's another problem. And also consent mode is another problem. Like, you're working with so less data, so much less data. And also, this is not us telling you to go and change your retention date right now. You have to check with your legal department. If you're in Europe, please don't go and change your retention date right now in the settings. You have to make sure that whatever you have there makes sense for where you are located and for your country legislation. And you have to declare to people how much you're going to retain their data for. So please don't go and change the setting right now. Yeah.
So that thresholding, like, I'm just gonna keep ranting on this
Please,
until
please.
it finally gets fixed. But for any of you that are using GA4 and haven't attended one of my rants before, I'm gonna give you an example of one feature that you'll want to immediately never use ever again in GA4. And that is Google Signals as a default
Signals.
reporting identity.
Yes.
So when you set up GA4, it asks you to basically link Google Signals. That's the setting right here. This
Insistently.
Yep, this powers the Google Ads integration, all the demographics data that you get into it. And almost everyone is going to turn this on because you want to use Google Ads and GA4 together. At the same time, Google also introduced a new feature where in the reporting identity, it actually uses Google Signals as part of the identity graph. So if Google basically has an ID, a Google ID for them, it tries to stitch their data together across devices and browsers. And it does this by default, and it sets the setting
To
to
blended.
Google Signals by default. Now, the reason why this is the worst feature I could ever think of is because there's a trade-off. And the trade-off is if you're going to access Google's like secret proprietary device data of Google signed in users, Google needs to protect that data and prevent you from basically de-anonymizing or figuring out who they really are. And to do that, they do something called thresholding, where they don't let you see rows in your report that have a small amount of users. So here's the classic example. Here's our pages and screens report. We have 478 pages that people see in the past month. Watch what happens if I select like a single day of data, like let's say I do May 10th. There's now only 17 pages that people have visited. And if we expand this, we're going to see a trend where basically we don't see any rows with less than 50. If I change this to any date range that's larger, I'll see more. But essentially, any page that someone saw that had less than 50 is excluded. It's not even included in the totals. It's completely removed from the report. So this is a completely inaccurate report of how people are consuming content on your site because the thresholding has removed a bunch of rows. And that can happen anywhere. It can even happen in the conversions report. I only have 6 conversions, but if I change this to a week, I'm all of a sudden going to have 2 more that now appeared. I wasn't actually able to see my purchase and my add to cart because they were thresholded from the report. So if you're using GA4, either don't use Google Signals or make sure that you go into the admin, you go into reporting identity, you click show all because it's hidden for some
Very
reason.
hidden.
And then you change it to device based. It's a flexible setting. You can change this at any time, but don't use Google Signals as an identity graph where all your reports have the chance of being inaccurate. And that's even your Looker Studio reports.
Yep.
If you're using the API and creating something in Looker Studio, you're likely creating reports that don't have all your data and you never realized that was happening. So I have been begging for this to be updated for, I don't know, it feels like 3 years at this point.
2-3 years, yeah. I remember the first you had like that Twitter, yeah. I know. Yeah, it's every day. Like I helped a friend today with his GA4 because he got migrated automatically, and it was like such a shit show there. What happened? And of course, and I was thinking like, see, this is so useless. Like the device one is so hidden, and you wouldn't see the show all is so like not visible. So people would just go into this, and the way they sell it, when you go first and click Google Signals for the first time, they have like this long text. You should read that text because it tells you what type of data it's used and it warns you about this. But nobody takes the time to read, so they just click, click, click. So I love it, but at the same time, we are not communicating a lot of things in a very good way. And
Yeah.
it's sad. And this thing that happens when you're looking at explorations and you're looking at standard reports and you're looking at total different data, and you want to put that data for the last 2 months in data that looks at the last year, is very hard to be data driven and make the best decisions. So yeah, that's another one.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're trying to be really positive, but
Yeah.
to go back to where we started our conversation today,
Yeah.
we talked about Google's decision to deprecate the attribution models.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what maybe hurt me the most was like, we have all these feature requests. We want all these kind of new things, or even what we might consider basic things.
Yeah.
And I'd much rather like the focus be there than like removing some features that are still potentially like valuable in certain situations. So I don't know. That's like, to make it full circle, why I think I was a little bothered by some of the attribution bottles being removed, maybe more so than I would be if I could just let some of that go.
You know what's one feature that they launched last year in December that I never was able to understand? Maybe you can illuminate me. So they said in December 8th, 2022, introducing behavioral modeling in real-time reporting. How?
So it's a black box. So behavioral modeling, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, that is a feature related to Google's consent mode. And consent mode is a feature that Google released to basically support identity list or cookie list data sends. So for privacy reasons, we're all dealing with this challenge of opt-in, where we're supposed to ask for consent before we track our users. And for a lot of people, especially in Europe, they ended up like losing a substantial amount of their data overnight, like in GA, because
Yep.
if they're opted out, then they weren't tracking them at all. So one potential solution Google released to help with that is they released consent mode, where basically it doesn't send an ID, it sends just the event or whatever they did into GA4. And then we end up with like two types of data. We end up with aggregate data. So imagine we tracked every page view, but only 50% of our page views had a user ID. That means that we have 100%. We know how many times all our pages were viewed, but only 50% of them can we actually connect to other pages or to conversions. Can we actually stitch to anything? So that means like total page views is an accurate metric, but users and sessions wouldn't be, because we need the user IDs for everything. So essentially what consent mode is it takes all the aggregate data, and then it takes the consented data and it tries to model it. So it takes a look at what the full picture is, and then what the small slice that you selected was, and it basically tries to scale it to what would have happened had you been able to collect everyone's IDs to do it. So modeling is basically another kind of black box. It's machine learning, it's predictive, it's just trying to take all the data and give you a picture of what happens. And that's another area where I hope Google like makes things more open. I think they could do something really, I think, impactful if they allowed marketers and analysts to actually see the model and rebuild it in BigQuery, and they didn't make it necessarily proprietary or a black box or some sort of secret. But what if we could replicate like in BigQuery and see the exact model that Google did and customize it? Like,
Yeah.
I give Google a lot of credit, and this is something I'm actually pretty excited that they're doing, is this challenge that we have with consented data isn't a Google challenge. It affects every marketing platform we use. And I haven't seen a lot of other marketing platforms come up with solutions to help like handle or deal with that. So I think consent mode and behavioral modeling are really unique in that there's not really anything else in the market to help with it. And I
Yep.
think Google could really have a unique advantage if they just made things more open and accessible, so that marketers could use behavioral modeling not just in the platform, but also build out everything in BigQuery for all their other marketing systems which might have it. But it just needs kind of that transparency and that openness, I think, to really accelerate that.
Yeah, and in Europe is it's a shit show with the consent mode, and it's implementing it and working with the consent banner solutions, which obviously kill the data. I remember we had I had a situation where there was so much money invested in ads, but and the traffic was there, the impressions, everything was there, but you would get only 10% of it because the cookie banner was blocking the whole page. Because so it's very like
Yeah.
important how you implement it and who you work with to implement consent mode for you, because you have to understand that if you're new to this, all the tags that you have are gonna fire based on that should fire based on the consent status, and everything that you track, it's 100% related to that consent mode that you implement. So it's less data than before that you have to work with.
Yeah,
And
it's tricky. It's really tricky to implement. And then the other challenge that I've seen is like a lot of this is Google making releases and feature updates to deal with some of the legal pressure and challenges that they're under, like with
yeah,
GDPR in Europe. And to my knowledge, there hasn't yet been like a lot of legal authorities in or DPAs that have looked at like consent mode and behavioral modeling and said this has like that GDPR stamp of approval that everyone's kind of chasing, right? So I feel like the other challenge is it's intensive to implement, and then it's kind of unclear like how everything's going to transpire from the legal side as well, which basically is it worth all the effort it takes to implement it? And
yeah,
then are we like compliant with how we do it? So essentially, I guess in short, there's not necessarily like a GDPR approved like consent mode playbook. There's still some questions around how all of that's going to play out. So hopefully like in the next 6 to 12 months, it becomes more clear and it can become more adopted. But I've also seen that as a barrier of adoption as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I know, and like I thought, I have to deal with this almost every week. So it's something that is becoming a norm, especially here in Europe. So we have 10 more minutes, and I promised people that we're gonna take some questions. And okay, so I have a question from Kate Cook, and she said, "How are you seeing your teams adopt the new data model and benchmarks out of GA4 world? Despite knowing drops are largely due to improvements in identity stitching and modeling, many are struggling to let go of their older GIU KPIs, Universal Analytics KPIs, and realize that they're dealing with entirely new tech. I'm interested in your experience and view on the change management and adoption of GA4." In
Yeah.
your specific one, not mine.
So it's a little hard for me. I have my customer base is like heavily on the enterprise or 360 version, and Google granted them a one-time extension. So they have like, I think, an additional year to use Universal. So just being honest, like because of that, I still have lots of clients that are using Universal as their day-to-day tool and haven't moved over to GA4.
Yeah.
But for those who have, like the best advice I could give is probably just to rip the band-aid off and just embrace that things are going to be different. And though it can be hard, I think we illustrated that with trying to stay positive. There are lots of positives about GA4. So I'll give you
Yeah.
like one thing that I've seen be successful for that conversation. So like mirroring metrics, that can be a tricky part, right? Because GA4 just counts things differently and things show up differently simply because, again, it's a different platform, and we can get into all these reasons why. But we talked about this on our last webinar. One of my favorite features in GA4 is actually the new conversions, because conversions work very differently and they have a completely different set of capabilities. The conversions or goals in Universal never really made sense if you think about it. And they don't make sense because they're session based. They only
Yeah.
count once per session. In addition, you only have 20, you can't reuse them. So there's lots of limitations on truly using goals the way you probably should or could. So simply in GA4, I'll give you some quick highlights. One, Google made an update, so you have 30 conversions instead of 20. Additionally, and more importantly, when we set up these conversions, you can archive them, and it archives the data as well. So that means you have new conversions you can work with. So if you wanted to do seasonal or campaign-based goals, GA4 now supports that, where there never really was an option to do like seasonal type conversions because you run out of them. And additionally, one of my favorite features is that we can create conversions that were never possible before. So the conversion logic in Universal was kind of dumb in that you could only say, I want this page to be a conversion or this event to be a conversion. So as an example, if someone added something to cart, that's a conversion. And maybe you could bring in the product if you had that as an attribute. But what I'm getting at with GA4 is we can do all this fun stuff. So I have an audience, and I made this audience and I said, I want to look at anyone who views my blog, and within 10 minutes, they contact us.
Yep. I
And
love that.
And there's this feature where you actually can use an audience trigger to fire an event when a user's in that audience, and then mark that event as a conversion. So what that means in summary, any audience you create, you can actually have audience-based conversions. So think about people who purchase $50 or more product, or people that started filling out a form, watched the video, and clicked on 3 things. Like, you could add all this complicated logic as a sequence or an audience condition. And now you can have the audience itself be a conversion. And that is why it's much more sophisticated from a capability perspective than what we had in Universal. So going back to that question, this is a way, I think, to transit it around something more positive, where when we're moving over to GA4, instead of just replicating our conversions,
Yeah.
we take a step back and think about what conversions should we really be tracking. And a lot of people have been limited by the constraints of what Universal could do. And this opens up a whole new like conversion setup that wasn't possible before.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. I really like the way it works. I never like goals, never will like goals. And I guess like one best practice that I've seen that is not very respected is also to make sure that when you're marking events as conversion, you're following on the outcome, not the action. Because I've seen a lot of people make conversions like clicked or something like this. That's not the conversion. So you have to make sure that you use the recommended events by Google, because if you don't use those recommended events, and if you don't use snake case, and if you don't flag outcomes, then you're gonna have a lot of issues. Oh, Charles, the question about this.
But
I
wait, are you calling me out right now? Because I have
Yes,
my
I
page
mean,
view and my scroll and my emojis.
and your emojis, yeah. But as a best practice, please do outcomes for the love of God, and don't write them like title case. Just work with the recommended model. I have a question. So if, let's say, because if I make an event that is not the recommended Google event, but I still use snake case to do it, and I mark it as a conversion, can I still use that in the audience and segments and export them if it's not in the recommended event?
Yeah. So what Juliana is referring to is it's really important in GA4 to follow this naming convention where you're pretty much using underscores and you're not using spaces. And also you probably want to avoid using uppercase.
Yeah.
And there's some reasons. Like, one is actually if you use a space in an event, there's been a bug for 3 years where you can't use an event with a space as an audience using that audience trigger that I just showed you. So just don't use spaces. Hopefully that gets fixed. So the answer to your question is, as long as you're just doing everything with no spaces, everything should work perfect. The reason we don't want to do uppercase is just to obviously not fragment with different casing conditions.
Yeah.
But yeah, the space is the one you should avoid at all costs right now in your event names.
Cool. And because we're almost at the end, I'm gonna ask you a question that we left about last year when we did this. So is real time still working in Universal Analytics?
Don't ask that. Don't use real time and Universal. It hasn't been trustworthy for like years. So that is something that GA4 is supposed to do better, is that real time actually works and the data in here is actually real. So if you're not familiar with why we're both laughing, there's been a variety of issues with real time and Universal. And if you go to the support page, Google basically says, don't use these reports. And the numbers and the graphs are potentially inaccurate. So don't use real time in the old version of GA. This is where you absolutely should be using GA4.
Awesome. Well, yeah, so like as positive last thoughts, I think we both you shared yours. I want to also say that I love the audience builder a lot. I think it's so much opportunity there. Also, be careful with the segments. Segments are not the same thing as audiences. Segments only live in explorations. You cannot export the segments in Looker Studio.
You said you were going to stay positive.
Yes, it's cool because you can create a segment in an exploration, and you might like that segment, and then you decide, oh, I'm gonna turn this into an audience and use it. But yeah, that was a question that it came, and you cannot use those in Looker Studio anymore. It was a cool feature when you could use the Google Analytics segment in Looker, but that's one of those things that I missed.
So yeah, I mean that's where I'm hoping we get lots of updates,
Yeah.
because for those of you who do Looker Studio, we talked earlier in our session, there's standard reports and there's Explore. Looker Studio only connects to the data behind the standard reports. It doesn't access this data set that powers Explore. Google has been making these really interesting updates, right? We talked about how they added funnels to the standard reports.
Yeah.
They also added the funnels to the reporting API. So even though Looker Studio doesn't support the funnel API yet, it could in theory. And building on that, if Google opens up that API and like connects it to the tables, then that would potentially open up the ability to use segments as we've always known and loved in Looker Studio once again. So
Yeah.
there was actually a time last year, and I think I still feel this way. I had originally hoped that Explore would just become the only reports in GA4 and they would just cancel all these standard reports, because I think it would make things a lot simpler. But if that doesn't happen, if they just make Explore more accessible so you can replicate things in the same place, that would be like some really exciting functionality, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, now that you're on the screen, somebody asked yesterday, and this is, I promise, the last thing because we both have to go. You cannot export path explorations in Looker Studio. No, because somebody asked if you could do that, but you can probably do them on your own in a very nice way. You can
Yeah,
create some nice, yeah. I mean,
I,
I think, go ahead.
I think it's exporting a PDF unless there's a bug. So
Yeah,
yeah, you can get a nice screenshot. Again, it would be nice for this to I think be more accessible and live, but yeah. I think the other parts is like I know we're at time, but I think my like quick three things, like if we were to
let's
do
go.
anything with Explorer, is like I want the ability to change the column width. Everyone's been asking for it.
Oh, yes, it's
Want
so
the
annoying.
ability to see how many rows I'm looking at. Is there 10 rows? Is there 100 rows? I have no idea how many possible values I have in this report, which is important. And percentages of total. Like you
Yeah,
should be able to see the percentage of the total easily in each report so you can weight how important what you're looking at is.
yeah.
Those would be like the three things that I know I mentioned last time that I'm still waiting for.
The
Did you
rose is so
have
annoying. I think what I would like, I forgot even my train of thought. I think one trick we can show people, so you cannot see all your users. You don't have a dimension for that. So
Oh,
just
yeah, the
let's
seg-
show them how to do it. So you can create a segment, user segment, and then you can put page path.
yeah, I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, and
Which page?
then do you have path? There we go. Path and query string. That's the one that we need. And then we can have to put contains backslash. Backslash. So this means that at any point somebody that came was is gonna be, oh, but not, let's see how many users contains. Yeah, let's see. At any point in time, yes. That's there you go. 100% of all your users. So then now you finally have an all users segment in your exploration. That's something that I wanted to share because I didn't know about it some months ago and I found out the hard way. So now you can compare different types of users with all your users. So that's kind of the only way. I don't know why we don't have all users as a dimension. It makes no sense.
Again, like this is where percentage of total is so important, because I'm trying, if you're doing this, right, you're looking at all users versus paid, you're trying to see is there distribution differences in the row counts, right? So I want to know, is New York as a total higher or lower from all versus paid, or especially if I'm comparing like paid versus organic. I can't do any of that analysis in this report. I have to like export it to Excel and
Yeah.
do calculations, or obviously Looker Studio. So please, Google, give us percentage of totals.
Awesome. Well, thank you. This was fun. I have a feeling we're gonna meet again in 1 year.
Yes, let's do it every year.
Let's do it every year. But like I hope next year we can, make the rows bigger. We can see more in explorations. We can actually edit fucking reports. That would be awesome. It's after 10 o'clock, so I can curse. Yeah. Thank you, Charles. This was fun. Thanks everyone that listened or watched on LinkedIn. I'm gonna put this on YouTube in case you just joined us. So you will see it on YouTube because I paid for this to be recorded. And I'll see you guys on the internet. And let's see, how do you end the stream?
I'm just gonna hit X. See ya.
See ya. Bye.